Because when the German Basic Law and Constitution had been put into place, it really had two options for unification. One was Article 23, which was designed basically to allow the Saarland to rejoin into West Germany after the French left. And the other, I forget what it was, 123, 132, it was basically to have a merger, to have a new constitutional convention. By the way, that would have thrown all of Germany's international obligations in the air, and that would have caused a lot of anxiety. But we independently sat down with the West Germans who also said, look, this should be used with Article 23. And so it was based on this judgment of what was happening in East Germany. So it gives you a little sense of kind of how you can connect almost an anecdotal fingertip feel of something with kind of a policy judgment. The last point I'll make on this is that after unification was completed, Germany hosted the economic summit, the G7 summit in Munich in '92. So my wife and I, who and a nice way brought into the conversation, took a holiday visiting the Eastern Länder, and we rented a car and drove through. Because I just sort of wanted to see it on the ground of what was happening. And you couldn't help but realize this was going to take at least a generation. I mean, I think people, people always are hopeful, they should be hopeful, but you could recognize that the limitations of East Germany were going to be very difficult. And one of the ironies, going back to your question, Susan, about economics, West Germany had 40 years to develop a social market economy. And it was a very effective economy, a very efficient economy, but also had a lot of rules. You put all those rules on top of 5 eastern states that basically didn't have the growth, and it was going to be too much weight. And that's part of what happened on sort of the economic side. So it's not a surprise in some ways that people struggle with this going forward. What I actually find encouraging when I go to Germany, frankly, is the number of younger people from East Germany that are kind of incorporated in the system, whether in business or government or others. That's the future.
But, Bob, you made a really important point that I want to bring in actually both Majid and Hope on, which is this, it's going to take a generation, and that in some ways that was inherent in the event. My question to both of you is, we're now actually a full generation more or less removed from these events, and yet German politics suggests a different outcome than the one you might have thought of. Not only have we had the rise in Germany over the last few years of the AfD, the Alternatives for Germany, but it has been proven to be particularly politically strong in a very specific geographic way, which is to say in the former East Germany. So both of you, I'd like to ask, is this a direct result of somehow the failures of that moment in time 30 years ago? And what does it mean going forward for Germany's politics? Is Germany really separating into your version of blue America and red America?
There's a lot to that. It's been astonishing to me to see the dialogue in Germany over the past year, in which these division, there's front page news almost every day about a renewed division between East and West. A historian just published a book called The Takeover, looking at what happened in '89-90 and calling it the takeover. And East Germans are now taking to the streets and saying it's been 30 years since the takeover, enough. And some of those, that frustration is in fact going into the far right AfD. In a recent survey of Germans, whether they feel more German or more Eastern or Western German, the majority of West Germans, more than 70%, said they feel German. Not so in the East. 47% in the East feel more Eastern German, and only 44% in the East feel German. So, but this is sort of new. These feelings were there for a while in the 1990s, when so many people were out of work because all these communist towns in East Germany had been built around factories. They went out of business. People were out of work. The 90s were a bleak period, and now everyone's talking about them again. But then things got better. But since the refugee crisis of 2015, this has really brought about, again, this sense of difference, and we saw it in the European elections this year. If you look at the map of Germany and who voted how, I mean, it's right along where the wall used to be. It's astonishing. And the far-right party definitely gets a much higher percentage of the vote in the East than in the West, although absolute numbers, there are more people in the West voting for that party. So I do think it is, I mean, at least, and a lot of this is perception. I mean, part of it is economic, but there have been huge economic strides made in the East. They've invested over €1 trillion in the East. Incomes have come up so much, but they're still lagging behind the West. And there's still not a single German publicly traded company with headquarters in the East. And the West dominates, with the exception of Angela Merkel, politics, the media, academia. So a lot of this is psychological, of East Germans feeling somehow, especially since the refugee crisis, that they're being marginalized and that the government is, you know, why are you spending all this money on helping refugees? You know, help us.
So, Majid, how much do you agree with that, first of all, and how much does it matter? I mean, what are the potential consequences of a Germany divided in this country?
Well, I think there's definitely still a divided political culture in Germany, but that being said, the rise of the AfD, in my view, is overall a symptom of a crisis in confidence in liberal democracies, in Western democracies overall.
So it's not as specific to Germany?
I'd say there are German particularities. And to start in West Germany, there's, you know, the German political party system has for a long time been rather immune to right-wing parties for historic reasons. And even, this is true on a national level, but it's also kind of true for the regional level. Even when right-wing parties made it to the Landtag, the regional parliaments, they weren't there for very long. They had a very short lifetime. This changed with the refugee crisis. In a way, it was a trigger to establish a new political party, or to change an existing right-wing party, to be exact. And it has, in the western part of the country, a potential of 10–12%. And that I would call a normal development, which we now see in many European countries in the United States. In the East, it's different. There you have the base of 10–12% plus an extra 20%. And when you ask yourself why, I think one way of answering is you look at the voter transition, voter mobility. A large amount of the voters of the AfD in the East are former voters of the Left Party. So a different protest movement, the post-communist party, excuse me, with a different ideology, but a similar voter motivation, which is to say, we have no place in this society, or, you know, to express protest against establishment, and they just shifted from the Left Party to the AfD. I think that's one explanation of why it is so much stronger in the East.
So interesting. So I want to quickly, before we get to your questions in the audience, Heather, I want to take it to you on this issue of our side of the Atlantic, and you know, where and how we can assess the U.S.-Germany relationship today. There's a certain elephant in the room, obviously, around that. If you look at Germans' views of the United States and of our president, they have had a dramatic shift over the last 3 years. As everyone knows, Barack Obama was extremely popular in Germany, and it's fair to say that Donald Trump is extremely unpopular in Germany. When I last looked, he was very, very close to single digits, and that would make it one of the places in the world where he's the least popular. And the president, for his part, you know, seems to have almost an obsession with not only Chancellor Merkel, which is well remarked upon, but also with Germany itself. He repeatedly has an image that this is both the heavyweight power, but also that the idea that America has been cheated by this, that it really hasn't gotten anything out of this alliance, that these are fierce competitors who've essentially benefited from an American security umbrella, and not only that, but there's a sense that whatever Trump's particularities, perhaps actually more Americans than you might think agree with him. So does that bode the end of the relationship even after Donald Trump?
There's so much to unpack in that. How much time do we have?
That's our next conversation.
Exactly. I want to pull out just a little bit out of the U.S.-German context, but it's absolutely applied. This is a bipartisan comment. For well over the last 16 years, the United States has become a much more transactional actor about Europe. We have lost our understanding about the strategic value of Europe. So as that, and that not only, it's not, President Trump puts an extremely crude point to it, but Barack Obama said that Europeans were free riders. The frustration of the Bush administration in Europe not producing more defense spending, these are all old habits that now unfortunately are in extremely irresponsible hands. So for me, and the U.S.-German relationship is the core relationship that has to be right for transatlantic relations to work, because it's the largest economy in Europe, because it has responsibilities that if Germany does not agree with how Europe can progress, it's not going to move forward. Just ask Emmanuel Macron that. For the last 2 years, it hasn't moved forward. It's ready to move in that direction. So what I'd like to do, and I don't want to discount that elephant in the room, and you're absolutely right, for unknown reasons to me, why the president is so specific about Germany and German cars, but there are imbalances. Germany's economy and its current account surplus is a global imbalance. There are issues we have to address, but the United States has to return to understanding that our allies are our strategic strength. It is what gives us our power and amplifies our power should we choose to use it. We're choosing not to use it. So it so transcends just the U.S.-German relationship, because the German relationship is so important and so powerful. I think it feels these forces that much greater. And you're right. We used to explain allies as strength, and now we explain them as a drain. They're just ripping us off. They're not sharing the burden. We all have the responsibility in changing that narrative that allies, and Europe in particular, is America's greatest strength.
So Bob, I know you have a piece coming out that actually takes on this issue pretty directly, but you don't agree that Americans don't support our alliances anymore, do you?
What Susan's referring to is that there's a piece in the Washington Post online now that will be in the print edition tomorrow, where actually I'm drawing off the work of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. And what's quite striking, you always have to discount surveys, but the numbers about American support for internationalism, alliances, I think the numbers overall for alliances are like 74, 75%. For Germany, it's like 70%. And so there's a strong public support for that, for trade, for a series of other international engagement issues. So the point of my piece is that in some ways I think the American policy community, I mentioned, has gone into their own version of a voluntary knowledge self-education campaign and kind of lost some of their fortitude, realizing that the public actually is more willing to engage on these things and wants the United States to play a leadership role, by the way, in concert with others, not unilaterally. There are variations. Like, for example, it's quite interesting on alliances, going back to one of Heather's points, they basically want them for defensive deterrence. They're not so big on sort of incursions abroad for sort of understandable reasons. So the reality is, Heather makes this point well, is that it comes down to the nature of leadership. The public tends to have these somewhat uncertain inner feelings. If you go back and you look at 1946-47, which was the sort of the start of creating the system, right after World War II, there was a poll done about should America engage internationally. It was like 7%. and then rose to 14. Okay, so what was done in 47 and 49 was in partly threat, which allowed that to be organized. But it took some courageous actions by President Truman, George Marshall, and Atchison, and so on and so forth. We don't have that today. Maybe we'll have that in the future. I believe the U.S. system has some ability to kind of reassert itself on this, but this is why it's also important for people across age groups in this audience, because ultimately it depends on the public.
Well, speaking of which, I want to bring the audience into this conversation now. I know we have some microphones around and can ask you to offer your questions. Bob, I'm going to exercise my moderator's prerogative and ask one quick other question, because I know it might come up, or it usually does, and it should. President Putin and other Russians continue to this day to make a big issue about one of the negotiating points from this incredible period back in 1989 and 1990 when unification was being negotiated. And that is Secretary Baker's comment at one point in those negotiations that NATO would not move one step eastward. Now, of course, that was never written down in the treaty or anything like that. Is there anything to that Russian critique? And was that, in hindsight, a mistake not to have been more clear with Russia on that?
So Susan's being modest on this. She and her husband are actually writing a biography on Baker that comes out next year, so she's well informed on these topics. But look, what's telling about this is Shevardnadze, he was the foreign minister, and Kozyrev, who succeeds him, both say there was never American promise not to harsh NATO. That's rather dispositive in some ways. The second, for anybody who's dealt with the Soviets or Russians, the idea that they would fail to pin down in writing, an obligation kind of escapes them. Okay, and there's a third point that's more obscure but quite significant, particularly related to Germany, and that is, remember the argument that Bush presents to Gorbachev, that Gorbachev accepts in June of 1990 about Germany being in NATO, was that, we recalled, something I recalled, was that the CSCE, which Gorbachev very much admired its principles, had the principles that each country was free to join its own alliance. Okay? And so this is the moment where Bush says to Gorbachev, look, can you accept under CSCE principles? And that we would favor Germany in NATO, but they get to choose. And Gorbachev says yes. And that was probably the most dramatic moment I've ever seen in my life, because the Soviets at the table pushed aside. Now, however, what you're referring to, and it's important to understand a little bit of the context of this. Baker does go, and he's trying early in the process to persuade Gorbachev to understand the logic of having a united Germany in NATO. And so he says, not 1 inch sort of further east. He wasn't referring, by the way, and this is important, to any of the other countries. He's referring simply to the notion of Germany in NATO and whether there could be some special status for the eastern sort of lender. Frankly, as he acknowledged within sort of days, that wouldn't work given the nature of NATO, and so in all further discussions, we discussed about Germany being fully in NATO. However, the special arrangements related to, for example, the transition for Soviet forces out and non-NATO forces. So that created the basis of it. But look, Putin is not surprisingly trying to sort of take advantage of this to say Russia was, sort of mistreated. But remember where I started, because this is actually kind of important. While we were thinking about Germany, we're also thinking about the structure of Europe, right? And so, as you mentioned, it's a Europe whole and free. So as we're doing this, we also have to deal with the Baltics, we have to deal with Poland, and the Polish border with Germany, and so on and so forth. There was a design here, that historians can make their own judgment about whether it's faulty or not. But it was that a united Germany needs to take place in these transatlantic and European structures going forward. And as kind of as this conversation has suggested, look, whenever you solve a diplomatic problem, that doesn't mean it's got perpetuity. So the fact that you're going to have problems created by a global financial crisis, by immigration, and so on and so forth, that's for other generations to sort of try to deal with over the course of the problem. My own view, but biased, is this structure worked pretty well given the uncertainties, if you would have imagined the world in sort of 1988. And it created opportunities for people, whether in Eastern Germany or Poland or other parts of the world. But, the work of policymakers isn't done.
All right, a good note to end it on, but a good point as well. 30 years and it's still in place, the system, more or less.